Today I'm going to give a presentation on algae oil and the cons of algae oil and why algae oil in the industry just isn't there. Even though algae has its importances, petroleum prices are still low, and more than likely the government will keep them low for a very long time, as long as possible. So for the next few years, algae oil is just an over-costly production of oil that we don't need. As of right now, oil prices are $85 a barrel. They may go up, but they may stay the same for at least another 5 or 6 years. Another con of algae is that it's mainly used for medical research and medical production of drugs. So the medical industry and the pharmaceutical companies don't want algae, and any algae production they do get, it'll just go to them instead of oil for vehicle use. So even if fuel prices go high, algae can be used for even pharmaceutical needs, which will keep it even a more expensive price, so it's uneconomical to grow algae for fuel. One of the major challenges of algae is that the capture of CO2 is a very costly product. To put CO2 into algae on a consistent basis, you have to essentially be close to a chemical plant, but in essence you're trying to replace those chemical plants, so it's a lose-lose situation. In the end, you won't have enough CO2 to produce algae. Another disadvantage of algae oil is that it's not CO2. It does not decrease CO2. All it does is capture CO2 and then release CO2. So you still have that CO2 in the environment. Another major disadvantage of algae is that it needs phosphorus. As of right now, there's not enough phosphorus in the world to produce the amounts of algae we need to cover our fuel costs, our fuel consumption. One of the major downfalls of algae is the photobiorreactor. There are multiple photobioreactors on the market right now, but the smaller ones are ranging from about $14 million to produce not that much algae. The basic model for educational usage, which is 12 by 10, costs $200,000. So just the production itself is just so costly that no one has really invested in it. The only investors in algae are oil companies, and oil companies have decided that it's still easier just to make petroleum-based products, not algae-based products. Another major challenge of algae is siphoning off the water from algae. There's no easy way to do that. There's a centrifuge which essentially presses the water out, but at the same time you compress the oil out and you lose production. There's also an electronic way to get the water, to separate the water and the algae, but then again you're spending more money on electronics and electricity than you would gain in production of algae. And there's also a chemical way to do it, but then you're still spending money on chemicals. Those chemicals are still then going into the environment and having hazardous waste issues. Some major issues with algae are, besides the cost and the production, is location. The locations are in the desert, and then you would have to pump water in, which means you'd have to stay near reservoirs, which is near towns, existing towns already, where those existing towns are already draining the reservoirs. So putting algae oil in those areas just drains water use again, such as LA, Vegas, and the Southwest. They're already in drought, so building algae oil farms in those areas is unrealistic because it would just siphon off water for human consumption and livestock consumption. There's also a lack of standards in the industry when it comes to algae oil. There's no one area and there's no one research lab. There are multiple labs throughout the world doing some research here and there. So there's really no numbers or information that you can get on specifics for production and costs of algae oil. So with all of these downfalls of algae oil, there is very little possibility to see any actual algae oil industry within the next 10 to 15 years. Thank you. Is there any questions?